Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to join us for the first webinar in our brand new webinar series called Researching Silent Heroes. We are thrilled to be working again with the American Battle Monuments Commission to take a look at this process of how we research silent heroes and the opportunity it gives us to help develop historical thinking skills and also to help look at the history of war and conflict in the 20th century, hopefully in a new light. In these webinars, they're going to be split. The first half of the webinars, we're going to be focusing more on history. And in the second half of the webinars, we're going to be focusing more on research skills. So it's going to be a little bit of a hybrid. But in order to get started, I'm going to go through a couple bits of housekeeping and then turn things over to Liz DeLucia from the ABMC, who we're so thrilled to have join us. All right, well, first off, a couple things to know. Right now, Google Classroom is sending you an email and telling you that your webinar is late. It is not late. I promise the systems just don't all interface. What we need to do is get you through the webinar, check off attendance, and add it into Google Classroom. So please don't let that stress you out in any way, shape, or form. The second thing is we cannot see you or hear you. You can see us and hear us. So if you have kids in the background, if you've got the dog barking, if there's a problem, don't worry about it. We can't see, we can't hear. If you're having your dinner, keep enjoying. If you want to communicate with us, you can do so through the Q&A box. If you're looking for chat, I don't have it enabled on this Zoom account, and that's on purpose because we work with students sometimes on this Zoom account, and I am not monitoring student Zoom chat. We do have live captioning turned on. We get a lot of feedback from a lot of participants that it helps them. If you find that it doesn't help you, please just go ahead and hit that live CC button. You can turn it on and off, toggle it that way. So the way we work all of our webinars is that there'll be a survey at the end. That's how you get your attendance credit. That's how we know that you're here. We will get questions. Will you share the slides? Will you share the video? 100%. We always share all of our materials the next morning to Google Classroom, and we don't really hide them. We're going to drop an activity in there that says Webinar 1 materials. We're going to put everything in there. So if you want to use or adapt any of this for your classroom, feel free. The goal that we're working on in the next deadline is to complete your Life Before the War organizer between now and January 3rd. We kind of had to stretch the first module because the way the holidays fell. When you're done, there is literally a mark as done button. And it's really helpful for us if you hit that, because your research mentor doesn't want to go in and check your work if you're not quite finished. And if you are finished, then they can go ahead and get started and give you some feedback. When one module comes in, the next one launches. So the second one, which is Homefront, will launch on Friday, January 3rd, the same day you turn the stuff in. And we'll keep that schedule as we go forward. All right, before we get into the history tonight, I'm going to take a minute and turn things over to Liz DeLucia from the American Battle Monuments Commission. Liz will tell us just a little bit about who she is and what she does and what the ABMC is. You've been reading a little bit about it in your materials and watching it on the videos, but she's also kind enough to join us tonight that if you have questions about the ABMC or how it works, she'll be here for Q&A to answer them. So Liz, thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. You guys can hear me okay?
All good.
Awesome. So thanks to Lynn and to National History Day, of course, and this wonderful team that's been assembled for this program. As Lynn said, my name is Liz DeLucia. I'm the Training and Education Officer at the American Battle Monuments Commission, the ABMC, as I'll continue to call it, because it is quite a mouthful. It's a government agency with a noble mission: to honor the service and sacrifice of the American military personnel who served abroad, ensuring their stories and legacies are preserved for future generations. The ABMC manages 26 cemeteries and 32 memorials around the world, where fallen soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen fallen from World War I, World War II, the Korean and Vietnam Wars are commemorated. So the mission extends beyond the upkeep of the sites. It encompasses educating the public about the profound impact that these individuals made and fostering respect for their bravery and sharing their stories of valor that transcend time. So we're thrilled to have you all involved in this mission. Through your work here You will be helping to bring these stories to life for many of our visitors at our cemeteries, as well as through our educational outreach programs, which is something we're really focusing on this year and moving forward. So your work will directly contribute to preserving the memories of our fallen soldiers and fallen heroes, and will enrich the experiences of those who learn about their courage and dedication through the ABMC. So together we can ensure that their sacrifice is not forgotten. As someone who has worked for the ABMC for the past 5 years, both in the field at the Manila American Cemetery and now at our headquarters in Arlington, Virginia, I am happy to, as Lynn said, answer any questions you may have about the agency, our work, our audiences, anything else that may come up during your research. And I just look forward to being a small part of this program, and hope you'll feel the impact of your efforts, and the impact that you'll have educating the public and future generations about the enduring legacy of these extraordinary American heroes. So I believe I am now turning it over to Christopher Hamner.
Thank you so much. Lynn, can you confirm that you can see the big screen?
We're all good to go. And I'll mention, Liz and I
Fantastic.
are going to turn our cameras off during this section just to make sure that we keep the bandwidth going, especially for our teachers in more rural areas. So Christopher, it's all you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Lynn and to Liz for the introduction, to ABMC for the opportunity to participate in this project, and thanks to you all for taking time out of your busy schedules this year to really dig into some fascinating and I think really important research about military service and the Americans who wore the uniform. I've been lucky enough to be working on projects with the American Battle Monuments Commission since I think 2014. I have learned some incredible things. I have been witness to the discovery of some amazing stories. I've met some fantastic teachers. It is one of the most transformative projects that I've ever been involved with. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity, and I'm really excited to be sharing it with you for the next few months. So a sincere thanks from the bottom of my heart. The program that we're doing this year is a little different than ABMC projects we've done in the past, in that we are exploring American service in the four wars of the 20th century. So we're looking at both of the world wars, as well as Korea and Vietnam. And in the past, we have generally run a cohort that is specific to one conflict, and that's enabled us to kind of dig very deeply into one particular historical moment. One of the great opportunities we have in this project, because we're looking at all of the major conflicts of the 20th century, is to think in some broader strokes about the context of military service, what it meant, what it symbolized, what it did for the Americans who participated, and to look at some of the continuities and some of the changes over time. So when I sat down to pull together ideas for this introductory presentation on life before the war, I was really looking for things that connect the soldiers of the world wars, the soldiers with the soldiers of the Korean conflict and the Vietnam War. And there were two that really struck me as most significant. And those are the two that we'll dig into in our time tonight, just to give you a little bit of context for thinking about the world from which your soldier entered the service. So the two big themes I want to explore, the first is just to remind all of us when we're doing this kind of historical research that America's entrance into these conflicts was not foreordained, it was not inevitable. And in some ways, each of these conflicts, the American decision to intervene was accompanied with some degree of debate. It was often contentious or controversial. And so we'll think a little bit about the entry into these wars and why it was controversial. And then the second big theme that I want to talk about tonight is the importance of conscription in raising the armies that fought the major conflicts of the 20th century. Now, if you're younger than me, then you have lived your entire life in a world in which the United States has had an all-volunteer military, the AVF, was instituted in 1973. So if you're born after that, you've never lived in a world in which the United States has been drafting large numbers of soldiers. But in fact, conscription, the military draft, is the critical engine that drives the armies that fight all four of these conflicts. And so that's the second of the two themes. And we'll dig into both of them with just a few primary sources because that's what I love to do. Thinking about the inevitability of American entrance into these conflicts, even into the world wars, it's, I think, very easy to fall into this trap of thinking subconsciously that because a thing happened, it had to happen because we know that the United States will join the First World War in 1917, that was somehow, inevitable, that the United States was always going to enter the First World War. And yet, if we go back and we look at primary sources from the moment, what we see is that there is a great deal of political debate over the necessity of American participation in, for starters, the Great War. So the war had raged since August of 1914. The United States will spend 2 years and 8 or 9 months on the sidelines as the British, the French, Germans, Russians, Italians engage in the massive carnage of fighting in Europe. And at home in the United States, there is a very loud, non-interventionist, isolationist movement that often picks up the language of patriotism to make the case that the United States should keep its focus at home, it should deal with domestic problems in the United States first. Even an event like the sinking of the Lusitania, which is in a lot of high school textbooks, identified as one of the critical triggers that leads to American intervention. You can see the headline here on the right, but there are political cartoons, and I've picked out an example on the left, that are even in the wake of the sinking of Lusitania, making the case that the United States was, allowing the British to use the American flag in a way that made the Lusitania less than an innocent bystander. And so even after this moment, there are people making the case against intervention. Some of that comes from geopolitics and diplomacy, and some of it comes from just a very real fear of sending young American boys to fight and to die in a war that, by 1915, by 1916, had seen unimaginable amounts of bloodshed. This is sheet music from an incredibly popular anti-war hymn called "I Didn't Raise My Boy to Be a Soldier," and you can see it very clearly identifies itself as the anti-war, anti-interventionist movement. This is a shot of the Women's Peace Party, which was likewise an organized effort to pressure American politicians to stay out of the war. Jane Addams, the Progressive Crusader, was a critical figure in the Women's Peace Party. So if we look, you can see all sorts of evidence and data and primary sources about people who are arguing against American intervention. It is not a foregone conclusion. And even the existence of some of these propaganda posters that are exhorting America to stand up and to fight for liberty and freedom and decency against German militarism. I mean, in one sense, these propaganda posters are evidence of the controversy and debate around American entrance, because you don't need to have messages about the importance of intervening in a war if there is no anti-war sentiment to be pushed against. Americans like to think of themselves as a peaceful nation, and part of that in the early 20th century was expressed by a desire to stay out of wars that did not appear to directly affect the United States. With my own students, I see this a lot. particularly in the Second World War, a belief that the United States is, of course, going to intervene in the war in Europe against German fascism. And they are often really surprised as we go sort through primary sources from 1940 and the first months of 1941 to see that there is a really muscular, well-organized political movement opposed to American intervention. Here we are in the summer of 1940, and you can see a lot of women demonstrating in Washington, D.C., arguing against American aid to Britain. A lot of this will revolve around the Lend-Lease Act. And you can see in the lower left-hand corner, there's a woman holding up a silkscreen sign that says, "I did not raise my boy to die for Britain," which kind of reminds us of the sheet music from the First World War. I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier. And I don't think that it's coincidence that these are women organizing in this movement and that they identify as mothers. There is a very organized, well-developed, and highly public movement known as the America First movement in late 1939, 1940, and 1941 that argues to politicians in Washington that America has problems domestically and that the United States cannot afford, either in terms of lives or in terms of money, to get involved in a European conflict. You can see here a group of protesters, the woman in the front holding up a sign that says "Kill Bill 1776, not our boys." Again, this is mothers mobilizing themselves politically to push against the movement to get involved in World War II. They are demonstrating here in front of the Capitol building, again, against House Resolution 1776. That's the Lend-Lease bill, the bill that would enable the United States to lend or to sell military equipment to the British. And it's not coincidence that the Lend-Lease Act carries the numerical designation 1776. There's a resonance to that in American political history as well. And what we're seeing is an incredibly spirited political debate over the necessity and the desirability of American involvement in this European war. On the left, you can see a newspaper article from the New York Times that covers the tug of war between the executive branch, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the legislative branch. Roosevelt is asking Congress to change some of the legislation on the books that requires the United States to be neutral. Quite a bit of pushback, both in Washington and in the wider country. The card on the right comes from my hometown. I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And these are, if you look at it closely, you can see it's like a blank postcard that you could pick up, fill in your own name at the bottom, and then mail it to your representative in Washington, D.C. So it was a kind of pre-formatted piece of mail that you could send to register your displeasure with the interventionists in Washington. And if you take a look at that postcard, there's some kind of interesting language there about it's not just pushing a political idea, but it's doing it in a very specific kind of way, using some symbolism and some allusions that are interesting. As with the First World War, part of this impulse to remain neutral comes from, concern over American diplomatic interests and geopolitics. And then part just comes from this sense that it is wrong and might be fruitless to send American men to go die in a foreign war. And the SOS, Save Our Sons, is foregrounding the cost, the human cost of intervening in these wars. There is this incredibly spirited back and forth political debate that we can see really clearly in the primary sources. In 1940, Theodore Geisel, the beloved children's author known as Dr. Seuss, was a very, very prolific political cartoonist during the Second World War, and very much a staunch interventionist, someone who was ringing the alarm about the dangers posed by Hitler and by German fascism. And here I think he's poking at, some gentle fun at this idea that things that happen in Europe are somehow confined to Europe and cannot affect Americans in the United States. There's Uncle Sam slumbering peacefully, I think blissfully, and maybe naively. The idea that even though Europe and the United States are in adjacent beds, the diseases that are ravaging Europe will somehow not spread. And Dr. Seuss is raising the alarm that this is self-evidently ludicrous. But we could see other political cartoons from the same moment that are making other arguments, including this one about which is titled "The Only Way We Can Save Her." And you can see here, the issue is not just about what's happening in Europe, but democracy in general. And across the ocean, what's labeled as war-torn Europe is burning to cinders. And we see a figure labeled as democracy making this impassioned plea to Uncle Sam, standing in America, the last refuge of democracy. And here is the figure labeled democracy saying, "Stay out for your sake as well as your own." There is a line of political argument visible in 1940 and 41 that the best thing that the United States can do is to hold on while the war in Europe destroys Europe. And then hopefully once the war has passed, as wars must, that Americans can go relight the torch of democracy and self-government. But it's a very fatalistic vision that the United States is powerless to stop the war and that it must marshal its own resources so that it can relight the torch afterwards. There's also a more negative kind of strain visible here in the American pro-fascist movement. And this is one that my students are absolutely flabbergasted to see because we associate the United States with liberty and freedom and equality and self-government. The idea that there is a fascist sympathetic party, pro-American rally here held at Madison Square Garden. I still kind of boggle at this, looking at the marquee, that there's pro-American rally on Monday, and then there's Rangers Red Wings on Tuesday. But if we were to go inside Madison Square Garden, we would see a packed house, and quite dissonantly, to my eye at least, the American flag banners, George Washington, and Nazi swastikas. So there is a muscular anti-war, anti-interventionist political movement in the United States before the Second World War as well. And I have to remind my students, this is the side that is winning the argument. The United States stays out of World War II for more than 2 years. And it's not until the attack on Pearl Harbor in the Pacific that the United States will finally dramatically switch. The America First movement will meet once after December 7th, 1941 to formally dissolve itself. The president will ask for and receive declarations of war against Japan and then Germany in 1941. But none of this is a foregone conclusion. I don't think any of it is inevitable. We'll see a slightly different version of this in the other 2 wars that we're looking at in this cohort, in the Korean conflict and the Vietnam conflict. These are, I think, also understood as battlefronts in the larger Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union that stretches for nearly half a century from World War II until the 1990s. And in these cases, there is never a formal declaration of war. They are wars that the United States is sort of thrust into or dragged into. In the case of Korea, very quickly. In the case of Vietnam, gradually over years. In Korea, we see a military conflict that is largely a byproduct of the Truman Doctrine, which is a very public statement by then President Harry S. Truman about American national interests. And then on the right, you see a copy of the cover page to what is known as NSC 68. That is the National Security Council's memo number 68 to the president, a highly classified document that talks about the kind of world that the United States faces after World War II. The Truman Doctrine talks about the necessity of supporting people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. And what Truman is talking about there is the American belief that the Soviet Union was acting constantly and globally to push communism as a form of government, and that they were engaged in these projects not just in Europe but anywhere that the Kremlin believed they could get a toehold, that the United States for the first time in its history had to make an affirmative pledge to defend the interests of peoples who were being pressured in this way. Hugely dramatic break from what we just saw in 1940. And it's that pledge that gets the United States involved in military actions on the Korean Peninsula, which is a place that most Americans couldn't have found on the map in 1949. But this larger pledge to contain communism is the thing that draws America into this particular conflict, not a foregone conclusion. In the Vietnam conflict, we see something similar in that it is also a battlefront in the struggle against communism. But rather than a triggering moment where the United States suddenly discovers that it has to go to war, the story of the American involvement in Vietnam is one of gradualism. So you can see in these two headlines, sort of long-term, sort of steady escalation of the American troop presence, a much different story than we see in, say, the Second World War. Here we're looking at a decade of kind of rising, cresting, and then falling troops involved in the Vietnam conflict. And this gives us a great moment to pivot to the second thing that I want to talk very briefly about, which is the importance of conscription, the draft in mobilizing troops for these conflicts. Again, if you're born after 1973, you've never lived in a world in which the United States has used conscription to build its armies. But the four conflicts we're looking at in this program are all driven in no small part by conscription. Here we've got a notice from 1917, very early in the United States active war effort in Europe. 24 million men would eventually enroll in the Selective Service Act. They obviously would not all serve, but this is a broad societal effort to take men of service age and to use the government's coercive powers to bring them into the military. One of the things that's really useful to keep in mind when you're thinking about American military history is that this country has had a long and I think, very deep-rooted opposition to standing armies and peacetime armies. And you can see this all the way back to the American Revolution and to the constitutional moment. Americans don't like serving in the military historically. They don't like paying for the military in peacetime. They view standing armies as a danger. And so what we see until recently is an army that is designed by the founders to be expansible. That is, it will stay very small in peacetime, then it will expand like an accordion if there is a military emergency, only to shrink dramatically afterwards. And you can see that expansible army here in looking at the number of soldiers that are United States military. So from just under 100,000 in 1914, it's tripled by 1917. It will be 2 million by 1918. But the expansible army doesn't just expand, it also contracts afterwards. By 1920, we'll be back down to 300,000. It is the draft that allows the United States to build this army this fast. And we'll see that again in the Second World War. 1939 and 1940, the war has already started in Europe, but the United States Army is less than 200,000. In 1939, it's less than 275,000. In 1940, total U.S. military personnel, 334,000, 458,000, a very small army by design. 1945, we're going to see a massive army. The United States will send 16 million military personnel abroad, largely because of the draft. In 1942, in February of 1942, the United States will go to an all conscription model with very few exceptions for a handful of elite services and pilots. Every soldier who goes abroad in the Second World War will be a draftee, and you see, the headlines here talking about the success of these programs. We've gone from 458,000 military personnel in 1940, less than 5 years later, up to 12 million, right? That is the success of the draft. And you can see in a lot of the primary sources from this moment, some of the evidence about what the draft and what military service means to Americans and how it's being presented. We've got this 1943 poster that talks about the American commitment to liberty, to doing the right thing. And then a poster on the right-hand side that I think is speaking to some different things besides just liberty that military service also represents. Both the Korean conflict and the Vietnam conflict are going to draw similarly on the draft. These are draftee armies. That doesn't mean that there are no volunteers, but the draft is responsible for bringing in the majority of the soldiers. And the draft is a complicated instrument in that it works in part and very successfully to encourage people to volunteer. The knowledge that you might be drafted leads some people to volunteer before their number gets called in the hopes that they can have a little more say in where they go. We also see some kind of interesting changes even in this draftee army over time about who serves and about the social implications of that military service. This is the wall of Harvard's Memorial Chapel in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Memorial Chapel is dedicated to Harvard alums who were killed in the nation's wars. And you can see the side here for the Second World War is massive. Amazingly, given the amount of privilege that is involved in getting a Harvard degree in the first half of the 20th century, Harvard loses an extraordinary number of its alums in the World Wars, particularly in the Second World War. The college that loses the most graduates in the Second World War is West Point. That makes a lot of sense. The college that loses the second most alums in World War II is Harvard, which I think is a sort of surprising factoid. By the time we get to the Vietnam conflict, there have been some pretty dramatic shifts in the belief about military service. In the 1940s, there's an idea that if your family has done well by America, you have a greater call to participate in its defense. By the time we get to Vietnam, this is the list of Harvard alums who are killed in that conflict. And the difference between the names on that wall and this small plaque that's about the size of a dinner plate, I think tells us something interesting has changed. The Vietnam era draft focuses the country's attention in a way that draws a lot of young men's energies towards thinking about what's happening in Vietnam. I give this to my students a lot. This is the 1970 draft schedule. So what you do is you find your birth month across the top, you find the day you were born across the left-hand side, and then you figure out what number you had. So my birthday is July 25th. I've lit it up in yellow there. In 1970, that was number 3. If I had been 19 years old that year, I would very likely have found myself, well, I would have found myself going to Vietnam, because in 1970, they called the first 125 numbers. But the draft in the Vietnam era draws a lot of attention to the war in ways that make it unpopular. And there is a very spirited, militant movement among the young to oppose the draft on all sorts of terms. You'll see a draft resistance movement in the Vietnam conflict that we just didn't see in the Second World War in the same way. And I'll leave you with this idea. So on the left, we've got a World War II era poster. On the right, we've got a Vietnam era poster made underground. We're talking a little bit about similar things in terms of military service and masculinity, very different messages, and that's change over time. I'm going to hand things back to Lynn, and I will stick around for Q&A afterwards.
All right, so we're going to kind of transition here. We started with kind of the 1,000-foot view and looking at this from the big picture. But now what we're going to do is to make a shift and to look at how is it that we go about researching the stories of these individuals at very much the micro level. Because we have to really look at both, I think, to truly understand wartime, what happens during war, and how it is that we can go ahead and really do justice to these stories that we're researching. So what we're going to do, pause for just 1 second here. My apologies. I am not working with 2 screens on the road, and it is so much harder to do this without the second screen. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my second screen, or my primary screen here. And I'm going to, let's see here. Can you give me a quick heads up? Are you seeing the housekeeping slide? Yes, no, maybe?
I'm seeing your whole PowerPoint screen.
All right, sorry.
Okay,
Here,
there
I
you
think
go.
I know what's happening here. All right, sorry about that. All right, so what we're going to do is take it down now to the macro level to talk about tips for researching life before the war. Now, one thing to know going into this is that the research process is inherently uneven. No one is guaranteed to find entire stories, and our goal is to give you enough tools to find something. What we're going to do before we get started, though, I want to step back for a second and just think what exactly our purpose is. I'm going to start with the example of Bruce Dean Bradley. Bruce Dean Bradley was a seaman second class serving in the United States Navy, and 83 years and 2 days ago, he was killed with the explosion aboard the USS Arizona. Now, we're going to start backwards. We start by pulling his name off of a list, right? We have his name here on the Honolulu Memorial and the USS Arizona Memorial. But I think it's really important that we go past the horrific fire and the end of his life. Because if we're going to really understand Bruce Dean Bradley, we need to look at his life as a sailor aboard the crew of the Arizona. But we also have to look at his life before the war. We have to look at him as a child. In this case, this is his 9th grade homeroom picture from Elgin High School in 1938. And I love this picture because if you look at it, you can pretty much tell that that teacher had to line those students up by height. And poor Bruce here looks like the second shortest of the whole bunch. But I think it's important that when we look at some of these stories and some of these examples, I've also posted the links. If you'd like to hear more about Bruce's story, you can click on that and go to our website and learn more and see not only read his story, but also watch some video eulogies that were produced in earlier ABMC projects. We don't have video eulogies attached to this one, but I think it gives a great way to start telling a story. Now, what is our end goal? Like Liz mentioned earlier, our goal is to build these stories. And our goal is to put these stories first on the NHD Silent Hero page, and then cross-list them with some of the ABMC's educational materials that Liz was discussing and explaining. Because in the end, we want as many people as possible to know these stories. So if you haven't done so already, I would suggest that you go and play around on this site. There's more than 300 stories researched by teachers and or students to kind of give you some examples and ideas of what we're working towards. Now, if we're going to tell a story, one of the things we have to do is start with the most basic of sources, which for us is almost always the United States Census. Now, I am a big United States Census nerd, and if you love the census as much as I do, you know that it starts with the US Constitution. It starts as a way that every 10 years, we're going to count up the people with the purpose of allotting representation in Congress and knowing who lives and who lives where. However, the unintended consequence is that it has evolved into a remarkable historical record. And it gives us snapshots into families, into communities, and quite frankly, into ordinary lives in the past. And the census, the job of the Census Bureau, first off, is to establish these districts. So census districts can either be really large, and you can find the maps at NARA. So we've got one map here from Loup County, Nebraska, a very large rural area, and the districts are quite large. On the other side of the screen, you've got just the northern part of Manhattan Island in New York City. And every time you see one of those blue circles with a number, that's a different district. So districts can be literally miles wide. It could also be just a few blocks. Now, inside of each of these districts, census takers were sent out to gather as much information as they could. And we're going to start by looking at a sample. We're going to start by looking at a World War I service member. And so this is the Bilheimer family in Rockingham County, Virginia in the 1900 census. Now, your eyesight might be really good at this. Mine's not quite so good these days. So what I've done, this is where we're going to get to our interactive part, is I've taken this family and I've broken it up. And what I like to do before, I'm going to just do a quick talk through it, but I'd like you to go into that Q&A box and tell me what you can observe about this family, and tell me what questions you have about Reuben and Anna Bilheimer, their 2 sons, daughter-in-law, and 3 grandchildren living together in Virginia. So drop into that Q&A box. What are some observations, some things that you see? And what are some questions that you have? Let's see, we've got a couple things coming in. Yes, there is a family member listed as a 6-year-old, and the relationship to the head of family is servant. That's really interesting. I had to look at that one twice too. A couple other people picked up on that. Okay, what other things maybe catch your attention? Okay, all right. Who is the person a servant for? I don't know. That's all the information we have. All right, question here. When did the family buy their farm? That's a really good question. We know they own a farm. I don't know too much more about how big it is or what they're growing there or what they're doing there, but the family is living in a rural area. Let's see. We know from Erica that Anna Bilheimer, that she has 7 children, 4 who are still living. So that's a question. 3 of them have passed. How did they pass? Did they pass as adults? Did they pass as children? Let's see. We've got some other questions. Yeah, 2 of the children are not linked to an adult. We know that both Anna and Polly are grandchildren of Anna and Reuben, but it's not exactly clear, at least from this document, who their parents are. That's something we'd have to do a little more digging on. Let's see here. Question, daughter-in-law was also a servant. Now, this is what's listed as her occupation. We don't know exactly where she worked. And a lot of times in the 1900 census, you will see servant in place of things like housekeeper or cook. And that's one of the things where the language is going to change over time. All right, some other things that have come up. Who was Liz's husband? When did he die? Where are the other children? What education did Roz have to become a teacher? There's lots of different things that we can see. And also this question, why was Reuben a day laborer if he owned his own farm? We don't know. So there's a lot of different bits of information that we can pull here. I'm going to jump a little bit ahead in the story. And I'm going to let you know that Liz's child is John. We have a birth record to show that. And she was married to Garrison Bilheimer, who is listed in a record as Dr. Garrison Bilheimer, which I think is really interesting. We do know that shortly after this census, or around this time, that Liza left the family and left John in the care of his grandmother, Anna. We also know 10 years later, in 1910, the only people in the household are Anna, who's now a widow, the adult, and John, who's a 16-year-old at the time. We also know from records that when John is about 22 years old, his grandmother, Anna, passes away, and he goes to Chicago to live with his uncle Solomon. Based just on that record, Now we're going to go ahead and take a look at a different record. This is John Bilheimer's World War I draft card. And I was able to zoom this out so it's a little bit easier to read. Based on this second document, what bits of information or what questions can we ask about John's life now that he's 23 years old in Chicago? So go ahead into that Q&A box. What other observations can we make about John as a 23-year-old in Chicago? Oh, here's an interesting question. Why did he leave a farm that his family owned? That's a good question. Does the family still own the farm? Why would he have gone north? Let's see. It looks like his present trade is teaming. That's a good question. Generally, when you see that generally talks about teams of horses or teams of animals, which around this time would have not been uncommon, especially bringing things around a city. Let's see some other questions. Was he part of the Great Migration? Oh, well, it certainly looks like he would be part of that. Let's see, what other things? He may have gone north to Chicago to avoid some racism. So that's interesting. So let's see here. Okay, well, this helps make sense because Black farmers face far more difficulties oftentimes in this time period around the time of the century. Let's see. What else can we notice? What other key pieces of information does this give us about John? Let's look at his citizenship. Let's look at his marital status. Let's also look at some other key piece of information that's hidden in here. I know it's a little hard to read, but it's okay. We can do it. Start with citizenship. Is he a natural born citizen? Okay, so we can see that he is a natural born citizen. And we might, not really think that's surprising or important, but honestly, in the World War I Army, somewhere between 20 and 25% of those who served in the American military were not born in the United States, right? That's part of this big second wave of immigration. So that's important to know. A couple of you have also picked up that he has some prior military experience. If we look down at number 11, we know that he is a private in the ING for 1 week in Chicago, Illinois. What might ING stand for? Say, now we're starting to get it. This is the Illinois National Guard. So he had just joined the Illinois National Guard right before he fills out his draft card. And I think that's really interesting because that kicks back to what Christopher was talking about earlier, about how the draft provides an incentive sometimes to go ahead and enlist and register and volunteer. So what we're doing is we're taking little bits of information that we know, using it to ask questions, to look up things and learn more. And I'm going to be honest, this is like a tree of research. Sometimes you go down a branch and there's nothing there, or you just can't find things. Sometimes you might look up questions like, who was J.W. Ketchum in Chicago and what kind of business did he have? Sometimes you're going to find it, sometimes you're not. But all of these things provide clues. Now, I'll tell you just to kind of finish off the story about John Bilheimer. John does serve in World War I. He's assigned to the segregated 93rd Infantry Division, the 370th Infantry Regiment. Their nickname was the Black Devils. Like many segregated units, they were assigned to French command and not American command. Most of the 370th IR were actually put together by National Guard units from both Chicago and New York. In World War I, many of the units are very geographically segregated out as well. After going out on maneuvers with the French army, John and many others from the 370th were back sitting in a home having dinner when a shell randomly hit the home on November 3rd, 1918. The building was shelled. 34 men were killed, and John Bilheimer rests today at Wazan American Cemetery in France. Okay, last thing, before we move on, I think it's really important that we stop and address some of the limits of the census. And I love this primary source. This is from the National Archives, and it's in reference to the 1950 census. It's an advertisement asking people to please, and I mean please, be direct with the census taker. The question that I would ask is, I would want to know, what are some of the challenges of the census? Why is the census sometimes incomplete, incorrect, or why is it that sometimes people don't appear? Go ahead into the Q&A box. What might be some of the problems or limitations with this source that we have to consider? I see some comments on bias. Marley, go ahead and explain what you mean by that, or in what ways. We've got some comments, people sometimes have something to hide or are scared of judgment, right? Do you want to admit that you don't have a job? Let's see, some other limitations. Sometimes the census taker couldn't understand the people speaking. Sometimes there's language barriers or accent barriers. Sometimes names are misspelled. We see that particularly with the names of immigrants. So looking up your person using lots of different spelling variations. That's very, very common to get spelling errors, but also looking up at different variations of a name, William versus Bill versus Billy, and understanding that there could be issues there. Sometimes I see we also get information that, you're right, people sometimes just lie. You're correct. Sometimes we don't want to tell the truth. Sometimes people are scared of telling the truth, right? Do you want to admit that there's so many boarders living in your house that maybe you're not allowed by the law to have? Sometimes there's just, you've got a lot of good answers in here. Sometimes people just aren't home or they don't want to answer. We've also got a couple comments about distrust or skepticism of the government. Also, sometimes people don't fully understand or correctly answer the questions. Are you home when the census taker shows up? Or do you feel willing to trust them? And I think these are all really great things that we need to keep in mind, because oftentimes we get frustrated because we can't find people in the records. And what we find is bits and pieces where we find people in some years of the census and not others. But I would say one of our goals to think about is every fact we find, every document, every resource, every primary source gives us clues to go digging for others. And keep in mind, when we're talking about this, it's not the case that you're going to find 25 primary sources on life before the war. You might find 2 or 3 or 4. And that's okay, because that's the beginning of the story. And that's where we layer in, like, we know where he lived. We know what his address is. Oh, let's do some work with Google Maps. Let's try to figure out what neighborhood, what part of the city. What do we know from some secondary sources about who lived in this part of the city in the 19-teens? How does this connect to the Great Migration? So what we're doing here, essentially what our goal is to start to put the pieces together of life before the war. The goal for this module is to learn as much as we can about our silent heroes from the time they were born until they entered the military. Now, if you encounter stuff from military experience, great, keep it, stash it, don't focus on it now. Think about the people, think about parents and siblings and extended family members, think about communities, think about schooling and education, work or trade, religious affiliations, hobbies, friends, or interests, because this is so much about the story. If we go back to Bruce Bradley, he had a really awful day on December 7th, but that's not his entire life, right? We need to look back to see what kind of a person he was, the best we can tell. Now, to help you out, one thing you also want to think about is what sources can we gather to help illustrate this? We'll come back to this later on. Now, for the research process, and we're going to use this every time, there's really 6 basic steps. First, find the stuff. Second thing, analyze it, break it down. If you run into things that you don't understand or need help with, ask, we're happy to help you. Third, save the source with a clear file name and put it into your Google folder drive. Please make them JPEGs or PDFs. Put the information into your research organizer, ask questions that you can't answer, and then add the citations. Now, this might sound daunting, but the goal of the folders on Google Drive and the organizers is to make it as easy as possible. So what we have is a set of prompts. These are just questions to get you started. One tip, don't take them super literally. So we've got an example here. So the question, when and where was your silent hero born? Well, okay, we've got a direct response, April 28th, 1946 in Buffalo. But then what else can we know about where he lived and what was going on in this neighborhood? So the first part's the question. The second part is, what are the responses? Please do us a favor, put these responses in your own words. You don't want to get caught in pulling a big quote from somewhere and then it accidentally ending up in your writing. Not a good idea. If you have a quote, put it in quotation marks. Also, where do you get this information? How do you know this fact? And most importantly, to help your research mentors, where can you link to it? It's really important because we are going to publish these and share these with the ABMC. We need to fact check everything. So make it easy for us to fact check by linking directly to the sources. Now, one tip, if you pull from Ancestry, please add them to your drive and link them to your drive. That's important because some of our teachers are using Ancestry, some are using Ancestry Classroom, some are using Ancestry Library. If you link to the original, our research mentors may or may not be able to get it. But if you put the 1950 census in your folder, they can absolutely get to that. We also have a section where you give us more information. Maybe you found something that we didn't address earlier. And then finally, we have an area to put questions. If you're researching, you're like, hey, I don't know this, but I'm still trying to figure it out, put it in there. Sometimes we just don't know, but sometimes a research mentor can give you a tip or a trick or a suggestion on how you might find the answer. Finally, bibliographies matter. Because we're publishing, we do use Chicago Turabian here at National History Day because that's what historians use, but I want to make it easy for you. We have actually created sample citations for the most common things. My strong suggestion, just go ahead in and update these. So if you have the ABMC website, which all of your people do, literally change the name of the sample to your person's name, update the access date, and update the URL. If you do this, I can guarantee you've got a perfectly cited thing, and it's not going to take a whole lot of time to fix it. If you find multiple websites or multiple documents from Ancestry, just put them all in the box. Obviously, not everybody's going to hit every kind of source, but we've got the majority, and if you're stuck on one, just let us know. We're happy to help. Most importantly, if and when you need help, and you'll run into a research roadblock, it's the way it goes. This is where your research mentors come in. They are ready, willing, and able to help you, and you are welcome to reach out to them at any time. And if you have questions or you're not sure who to ask, you're not sure who your research mentor is, reach out to me. I'm happy to connect you. All right, we have hit up to the top of the hour, and I just want to mention we are 2 minutes under the top of the hour, which means we had some pretty good timing today. So this is the part of the program where we make a shift. We know we're up against an hour. We know some people have to go. Before you go, please take a moment to complete the survey. This gives you your attendance credit and gives us some feedback, because if we're going to do these, we want to make sure that we're giving you good information. And if you've got suggestions or ideas of how we can make it better, this is how you tell us. So you can get to the survey either by taking your phone and scanning the QR code, or the tiny URL, which is NHG-ABMC-live. Sorry, I don't get too creative when I make those. What we're going to do now is turn things open to Q&A. So you can ask questions about the content or the sources that Christopher used. You can ask questions about the methods or ideas I presented. You can also ask questions about the ABMC. We've got Liz here to join us to answer those. Our goal is to say at this point, if you need to go, thank you, good afternoon, good night. But if you want to stay, we are here and would be more than happy to answer questions or things you'd like to know more about. All right. So let's see here. Oh, here's a good question. Stephanie, do you have a list of questions to ask families if you are doing an interview? Yes, we do. Stephanie, shoot me an email and I'll get it over to you. Usually people don't pick up on and connect with those families quite so early in the process, but if you have, that's fine. My strong suggestion is get a little research under your belt first. The more you know, the better questions you're going to be able to ask. So if you've come into contact with a family, that's incredible. My suggestion, schedule a time to meet with them maybe in early January. We can always go back and add to those organizers, but yes, I've got some suggested questions and some materials that I'm happy to send you to get you going. All right, let's see. Oh, somebody said that the family member is her neighbor, which makes it a whole lot easier to find a family member, but I think that's wonderful. Anytime we connect with people in our communities, in our schools, that's really a whole lot of history magic. Give it just a second. On the first webinar, people are shy and don't want to ask us questions. I don't know why. This happened in the last program. And they wait. Oh, here's a good question. Christopher, I'm going to toss this to you and then I'll add to it. One of the challenges that we found is that sometimes the silent heroes we're researching, when they come from rural areas, there can be less information available in the community. What kinds of suggestions can you offer researchers when they're looking at people who lived in or grew up in rural areas?
That is a tough one. I think it gets even tougher the further back you go. So one thing that I've seen researchers have a lot of success with is trying to explore other kinds of like clubs or community engagement or civic engagement, whether that is a church or a religious institution that might leave records. If you've got, high school records that let you know that somebody was involved in a particular, had a hobby or a particular interest. We've used with mixed success. It's a crapshoot. So it's feast or famine. Local newspapers, a lot of which are available on the Library of Congress. So you may find out that there's like a regional newspaper that doesn't necessarily give you particular information about a given 19-year-old, but may enable you to kind of fill in some of the gaps about what life is like in that part of the country or that part of the world at a particular moment. But one of the things that you will learn over time doing this kind of historical research is that some places are better lit than others. So, you're looking for information on a particular person or a particular region, and just the way that the historical record works is some places are really rich with information. Some places make you work a little harder.
I agree with all those. I would also add in, is there a county historical society or a county library? Because oftentimes, sometimes just getting a couple calls and finding, I always say some of the fairy godmothers of this kind of research are, I'm going to say this nicely, these senior citizen ladies at either the library or the historical society who love nothing more to dive in and might be able to look in their records to see if they have anything from the families. Sometimes they have local newspapers that haven't been digitized into national sources, or might be able to pull some things to say, well, hey, if I'm going to drive out here 2 hours from my house, they might be willing to meet you on a Saturday and share resources and information or help you for an hour or two. So those would be two other things that I would look for. And it's going to vary a little bit, but again, reach out to your research mentor. They might be able to give you some specific strategies or suggestions.
Let me just underline the value of local historical societies, which are exactly as Lynn described them. And also staffed usually by really passionate people. Often there's a lot of volunteers there. They want people to come and access the materials. If there's like a college or university within the area, it is worth sending a quick email or making a quick call to their special collections librarian. Again, you're kind of rolling the dice. But particularly with military stuff, there's a chance that a family or a local organization donated some papers, and that they're being kept in collection there. And if you look under enough rocks, you'll start you'll get lucky a few times. So that might be another place to just dash off a quick email or send a quick call.
All right. Two questions. Suggestions for finding information other than Ancestry or Find a Grave on websites. I'm going to be honest with you. This is not really a website heavy project. We're going to use databases like Ancestry. We're going to also encourage you to use things like newspapers.com and Fold3, which if you've got Ancestry Classroom, you also have access to those. But oftentimes for the first phase of the research, there's not a whole lot of other sites that are going to be very helpful unless you really stumble on a gold mine. So I think one of the suggestions is to see what you can learn in those communities. What about histories of the county? Oftentimes, especially World War II, Korea, Vietnam, someone in the community started keeping track of local individuals who served and who didn't come home, whether it's newspaper clippings or little stories or little vignettes. But the other thing to realize, if we think about our goal, when you look at some of the profiles on the site, they're not all hugely complete. Oftentimes, sometimes you get a life before the war section that's a paragraph. Sometimes you get 3 or 4 or 5, but most of the time it's 1 to 2. We're looking to uncover what we can, but we also can't make up the things that we don't know. All right. Here's a question. Do you have tips to help finding school records when schools have changed many times over the years? That's a hard one. Often you want to see whatever school or school district is in that area now. Sometimes it's worth giving a call to say who holds the school's records. Sometimes they've all been transferred to district offices. Sometimes in the school district where I used to teach, the high school where I taught was the original high school of the school district. So because of that, all of the old materials, old yearbooks, old school newspapers from that school lived for the whole district at that school. So if you can kind of find out, reach out to high school librarians or reach out to superintendent's offices. They often can sometimes be very, very helpful. All right. Here's a military history / ABMC question. Kate was doing some research and she found in her research that a soldier couldn't qualify for a Purple Heart in the Vietnam era if they were not treated by a medic. Her soldier died instantly. Is that the case or no?
That is so technically that's not the case. A Purple Heart goes to anybody who has been wounded as a result of enemy action. The wound had to be serious enough to be treated by a medic. But in the case of someone who's killed by that action, it would be self-evidently serious enough. So that one, I think, requires a little more digging. And the first place I would look is, what you know from the soldier's file about why they weren't awarded a Purple Heart. There's all sorts of potential reasons or explanations. And I do a little bit more digging. So is it possible that the soldier wasn't killed by enemy action? So this was like some other accident. It's possible, I mean, it happens that soldiers suffered self-inflicted wounds and were not eligible for the Purple Heart. So there's a couple of reasons, but simply not being seen by a medic should not be disqualifying. It's as a result of enemy action and something serious enough to require medical attention. Anybody who's killed instantly is understood to have been, as the highest severity.
Okay. Got a couple different questions here. Here's an interesting question. So sometimes, especially with more recent conflicts, Liz, I want to toss this one over to you. Sometimes you find these pages on the internet where other veterans are talking about stories about fellow service members who were killed in action. So in this case, this teacher has found someone else saying, I know how this guy died. How do you handle that kind of information at the ABMC? How do you determine what's valid and reliable versus what might be correct or incorrect?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you definitely see more of those probably in the Vietnam era than anything else. With the tech savvy folks coming into the computer age. But I think, and I'm not our agency historian, but I think, having done some of this research myself, the way that I would handle it is it's obviously a resource to take with a grain of salt, as any oral history would be, and you want to. I think it's super helpful because it can give you an avenue to explore that maybe you were unaware of, and can lead you down a different rabbit hole of research to corroborate or not the information that you're being given. And sometimes you're just not going to know. You're not going to find the document that solves the case and puts all the nice corner pieces of the puzzle together. But I think you should treat it, as what it is. It's in the case that you're describing, Lynn, like, say, a firsthand account. So perception plays into that, and we all have a different perception can have a different perception of the same event. So if you can use that in your research to find things, to try a different search, use different language to try and back up that information, you could find something really useful. Or you could say, well, I found no evidence of this, so you know it exists here and this may have happened, but we can't verify that as actual fact.
And oftentimes, sometimes we get family accounts, like, for example, his niece remembers him always joking or having candy in his pocket. We can qualify that by saying his niece name remembers that, because that's something we might not be able to independently verify, but we're going on a pretty good source. And we would also want to see, like, how does that, if that story line up with the account from the DPAA about where they were and what was happening and what was going on. All right, we've got a lot of other great suggestions in the chat, things like connecting with churches, particularly maybe even connecting with churches that would have worked or functioned primarily in other languages. So like an Italian Catholic church at the time, what records they might have. We also have some suggestions about looking at land records if you want to know more about who owned a piece of property, but also potentially connecting with veterans groups. So like VFW groups, or there's several variations on those, because sometimes they collected history records, but oftentimes they're going to be very good about knowing who in this county might have the records or might know things to help you. All right, let's see here. I have a question about if you're running into huge roadblocks and you're interested in switching to a different silent hero. My suggestion is talk to me before we do that. Once we start going down that path, it can get very, very tricky. And we also don't know what kind of records might be coming from the National Archives, because I'll be honest with you, I think there's a general rule. We either tend to find a whole lot about their life before the war and very little military, or vice versa. So if you don't have a whole lot, don't give up quite yet. We had a teacher in another program and she was ready to change. And all of a sudden a family member came through, a friend of a friend of a friend, and literally 12 documents was emailed to the teacher the next day. So talk to me if you're feeling stuck, but let's see what options there might be. All right.
Lynn, if I can just jump in for a moment from the perspective of ABMC, there are cases where we talk about those who are listed on our walls of the missing, for example. For instance, I used to speak about a flight nurse. So we knew about her military history and that she died during World War II, but we didn't know much about her experience during the war. So we were able to use the records of a different flight nurse to kind of fill in the gaps as to like what life may have been like. So even if you get that partial story of whether it's just the military service or if it's, how they grew up, it all kind of adds to the overall story that we're telling. So it may not be, the nice, neat package that everybody wants, but it is incredibly useful and profound in the work that we do at the American Battle Monuments Commission. So keep at it.
And keep in mind, none of these are perfectly complete puzzles at the end. And that's part of the joy. The other thing I love about posting these stories is that sometimes families will find us months or years later. We had a family reach out about a service member in Normandy American Cemetery and said, We have pictures of our great uncle. Can we add them to the profile? And the answer is 100% yes, right? That's part of telling this story and preserving it for the long time. All right. Well, there's a couple of people who have some more individual questions. So I'm going to reach out to you individually tomorrow just because I want to be cognizant of time. I'm going to throw out one other suggestion from the chat, which is using Google Books, particularly with older books, looking at World War I and World War II era, books that are out of copyright sometimes can be very, very helpful. All right. So that's where we're going to make a pause. If we missed a question or if you have other questions and I didn't get to it, I missed it, please shoot me an email and either I will answer it or I'll forward it over to Christopher or Liz to make sure that you get the answer, because that's part of what we're here to do. What I want to do is pause here. I'm going to say a huge thank you to the American Battle Monuments Commission and Liz DeLucia for all the work she's doing to make this happen on their end. I'm going to say thank you to all of the teachers out there for the work that you're doing to help bring these to life. Just a reminder, make sure to complete that survey. So either snap your phone, take the picture right now. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. If you're on your phone, like I can't take a picture of my phone with my phone. Don't stress about it. I'm going to shoot you an email either a little later tonight or tomorrow morning that says, hey, we need you to complete your survey. And you can go ahead and do it. All teachers have a full week after the webinar to complete, make it up, and get full credit, because we know no whatever time we pick live, it never exactly works for everybody live. All right. I'm going to pause there. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your effort. We'd love to hear from you and are excited to see what you learn about your silent heroes in the first phase. And we'll be back with you again in January 2025. Have a great night.
Take care, everybody.